Thank you, Havens. So welcome everyone. My name is Vanessa Cardamone, ACAPS Climate Analysis Advisor. I will be co-facilitating this session today from ACAPS, Abbas Diop, ACAPS Senior Analyst leading on the risk radar. The session will last around 90 minutes. Please mute your microphone during the presentation. There will be a Q&A at the end of the risk radar presentation and at the end of the panel discussion. Please ask your questions in the chat. So following the welcome and introduction, we will share an overview of ACAPS risk radar, and then we will follow with a panel discussions on challenges and solutions in addressing compounding and multi-risks. About ACAPS, so ACAPS is an independent analysis provider providing tailored support, capacity strengthening to humanitarian decision makers. ACAPS also advocates for the humanitarian responders to apply an evidence-based approach to decision making. We can move to the next slide, please. So with us today, Tess de Bourg from the Red Cross Climate Center. Tess is technical advisor, climate and conflict, where she focuses at the Climate Center, where she focuses on innovation in multi-risk approaches and institutionalization of climate-smart humanitarian programming in conflict-affected settings. Michael Chouhaney from Mercy Corps' Middle East Europe Crisis Analysis team is a quantitative analysis specialist, and he was leading on the Middle East anticipatory climate action model, which provides geographically disaggregated agricultural, drought, and flood predictions in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Adrien Degues. Adrien is a senior advisor in the Diplomacy and Security Program at Adelphi Research in Berlin. He holds a PhD in political science with a focus on climate security and computational conflict risk analysis. Adrien has extensive experience in assessing geopolitical and security risks in connection with environmental change, as well as in early warning systems for floods, droughts, and their knock-on effects on food security, displacement, and conflict. I'd like to thank our panelists for being here today. We will now present the risk radar. So why ACAPS decided to develop a new risk tools? First of all, because we are observing an increasing overlapping climate and conflict crisis, which are increasingly driving humanitarian needs worldwide. Single hazards early warning are struggling with cascading effects, and we're also observing that there is now rarely just one hazard triggering humanitarian needs in countries. There is soon a need for increasing and more effective forward-looking analysis, context-sensitive risk analysis, in order to anticipate these risks and address them before they translate, before they become disasters, before they impact humanitarian needs on the ground. Over to you, Abbas, for a presentation on the risk radar.
Thanks a lot, Vanessa. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to give you a general overview of the risk radar. So this is ACAPS's forward-looking analysis online tool designed to alert on humanitarian risks before they materialize. So we have launched this tool in October 2025. As an upgrade of the previous risk list with some additional features and an improved user experience. So we are still in that post-launch phase where we are still assessing the tool's performance from a technical perspective. The risk radar is accessible on our website and also through API for those interested. And it was built mainly to answer two questions. What might go wrong in the next 3 to 6 months, and where should decision makers be paying attention today? And to do that, we have developed a narrative-based and analyst-driven approach, in the sense that the risk entries are written by analysts with local or regional expertise, someone who can pick up on any political tension or any community grievance or leadership change long before it appears, long before it appears in any data set. So that's the main, I would say, point of differentiation with other purely quantitative tools that only trigger alerts whenever a certain threshold is met. Next slide, please, Evans. Thanks. The risk radar is built around three core objectives that together define what we're trying to achieve. The first one is the most obvious one. It's early warning. We want humanitarian actors to know about a potential crisis before it becomes obvious, because by the time a situation becomes headline, the window for anticipatory action has often already closed. The second is preparedness support, because we believe that early warning is only valuable if it translates into action, and that translation happens through contingency planning. So the risk radar is designed to build to feed directly into those processes. And the third element is situational awareness. And this is where the continuous update cycle becomes particularly important. A risk, if we take a risk that we identified 3 months ago, it might look very different today. So rather than publishing a static analysis and moving on, the risk radar tracks how risks evolve over time, giving users a living picture of the humanitarian landscape. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to speak a little bit about how it works practically. So each risk entry in the risk radar contains 4 core components. First, there's a rationale, which is a narrative explaining why and how a situation may deteriorate and lead to humanitarian consequences. Then we have an expected impact section, analyzing how a hazard will affect people or the environment. Then we have a trigger component pointing to observable events or facts that whenever they happen indicate that the hazard is likely to materialize. Then we have a vulnerability and coping capacity section, because the same hazard can have very different consequences depending on the coping capacities of the affected populations. Now, in terms of the inclusion criteria, because in some ways many things can become a risk, and that also depends on the definition of a risk that we have in our methodology. The risk radar focuses on events likely to occur within a 6-month horizon that could significantly increase humanitarian needs in one or more countries, particularly where preparedness and response capacity is limited. Now, when it comes to the workflow itself, risks are identified through the daily monitoring of humanitarian development that our analysts perform across the globe. And this feeds into a monthly horizon scanning call where the team collectively discusses whether to open a risk entry. And then based on that discussion, the risks are drafted and reviewed and then published. That said, we maintain a certain level of flexibility in the sense that we're not waiting up until the next scheduled call to raise a risk. Whenever we come across some early warning signals that warrant raising a new risk, we would go ahead and draft it regardless of let's say, our internal agenda. Once a risk is identified and drafted, it goes, as I said, through an internal review process, and this typically takes 3 to 4 days before the risk analysis becomes live. However, in some exceptional cases, we can fast track some risk alerts and have them published within a 48-hour turnaround, depending on the urgency of the situation. And whenever there is a significant event changing the trajectory of a risk, let's say that there is a sudden conflict escalation or a policy shift or an unexpected climate event, we reactively update the risk metrics and rationale, ensuring that the information you're working with reflects the situation as it actually stands. Now, looking at how climate and conflict are integrated in our analysis, actually, a question we often get asked is how do we bring climate and conflict together in a single analytical product, and why that matters? And the answer starts with a deliberate choice which is that in the risk radar, climate and conflict are not treated as parallel tracks that occasionally interact. They are analyzed as a single integrated narrative. So when we write a risk entry, we are telling a story about how a drought, a flood, or an extreme event interact with armed group dynamics, displacement trends, or intercommunal tensions to create something far more significant than either factor alone. The same approach applies to the triggers. Rather than identifying or flagging a climate trigger separately from a conflict trigger, we look for the moment where the two converge. And by experience, we notice that these combined triggers are often the most reliable early warning signals, precisely because they capture the interaction, not just the individual hazard. And that brings us to what we consider the analytical core of this work, which is interaction and cascading effects. Because the relations between climate and conflict are dynamic in the sense that they reinforce each other in so many ways. With the risk radar, we try to trace those feedback loops explicitly, mapping how one hazard can trigger, escalate, or deepen another across time. Another element that contributes to this integration is the analysis of linked vulnerabilities, because we don't assess climate vulnerability and conflict vulnerability separately and then add them together. We ask ourselves, how do they interact within the same population, the same geography, the same institutional context? And finally, risk entries are revised on a monthly basis, typically, as the climate situation, the conflict dynamics evolve or shift, and as new early warning signals emerge to align with the dynamic perspective that we aim to provide. So yeah, this was the last slide on the risk radar. I'll open the floor if you have questions on how it works, what data it draws on, or how you might use it in your work. Please, feel free to raise those in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abbas. Yes, we're going to take a few questions from the audience or from our panelists, if any, before moving to the panel discussion. There is no burning questions right now. You can add your questions to the chat. I see there is one question. How do you obtain the data? What's ACAPS data source? Would you like to answer on this one, Abbas? I can complement on for climate data.
Yeah, definitely. That's a big question. At ACAPS, we mainly work with secondary data information, which means that our analysts on a daily basis, they scan through all the news articles and publications from other analysis actors from different organizations to capture what are the main issues that we should pay attention to as humanitarian analysts. And our main, let's say, direction is like, where do we think that needs might increase as a result of some triggers, be it conflict triggers and or climate related triggers or other types of triggers. So the way we do it is that we look at these qualitative sources from the daily monitoring, but we also use existing data sets on conflict, for example, to also capture any interesting trend to pick up on, and in addition to climate analysis sources that on which Vanessa can elaborate a bit more.
Yes, thank you. So in terms of climate analysis, we use seasonal forecast, 3 to 6 months, mainly from Copernicus, IRI, and WMO. To anticipate precipitation and temperature anomalies. We've been using these sources of data for a number of products, including those focusing on La Niña and El Niño, and they proved to be extremely effective in anticipating impact from precipitation or temperature anomalies, anticipating droughts and floods, for example. We also look at the previous impacts of climate extremes in the country or in the region. So some pre-existing climate vulnerability factors related to population data, for example, internal displacement. Of course, conflict, which increases the vulnerability to climate shocks. So these are some of the data we use I'm just looking at other questions in terms of and what's interesting in what we do is, as Abbas was mentioning, is that we are really analyzing different sources of data, so including conflict data and climate data as a whole. So we're not analyzing them in silos. We're looking at how they interact. And that's why we have often we raise just one risk per country, which includes different triggers. Looking at other questions, there is one from Laura from Start Network on whether we received any feedback on applications by decision makers.
Yes. So on this one, I cannot say that we received very clear-cut feedback on application by decision makers. We have received anecdotal feedback on the value of the tool from different types of organizations, donors, but also other UN organizations who also integrated into their workflow and their decision-making, let's say, toolbox. And we also noticed a significant increase in the usage of this tool in our website monitoring figures. So we have some indications about that the fact that this is being at least viewed by people, but because it's pretty new, we are still in the process of evaluating the actual impact of this tool. So probably 6 months from now we will have a bit more clarity on that information per se. And I see another question around potential economic and social indicators. Actually, we don't have a set of indicators that are ready to use. The triggers and indicators that we develop in our analysis are always contextual. So depending on the situation we're talking about, we would identify triggers that would represent like a signal for escalation or deterioration of a particular humanitarian situation. So unlike like some indexes that have a set of indicators that are ready, we always adapt our let's say indicators or triggers, if you will, depending on the context. I hope that that helps.
And also
And just
if I may add, the expertise, the country expertise of crisis insight analysts, because how many people are working on the risk rather of us? So it's
and
quite a large team with like specific contextual expertise in different countries.
yeah, definitely. And maybe just to finish with Tess's question about the validation and evaluation approach. Actually, one of the I think one of the innovations of the risk radar is that we document the outcome of each one of the risks. So we document whenever they materialize, but also when they do not materialize. And this is also a very important learning tool for us to improve the way we flag risks and also build our institutional knowledge and be able to better assess, because sometimes you can see something happening and everyone starts saying, okay, let's draft a risk, and because this is a risk. And then when you look at past events, you would realize that actually this has happened like several times, and it didn't lead necessarily to any significant increase or observable increase in humanitarian need. So we are constantly trying to also balance this media pressure and trying not to be always guided by the crowd, I would say, in terms of the noise that is being heard on some information. And about the let's say the marked deterioration in existing crises, this is a big part of I think a big amount of the risks we raise are on those crises, and they are quite hard to draft, in the sense that, let's say, in DRC it's so difficult to pinpoint a new risk, because anyway we already know that the situation is quite bad and that it's likely to get worse. So we are always trying to find the new angle, or what's new and how it interacts with other factors, making it worth at least considering from decision-making perspective. Over.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for your question. I think we can start with the panel discussion. We can move to the next slide, please. And before giving the floor to our panelists, we'd like to ask our participants, what are the main challenges you face in anticipating multi-risks? I can imagine you have different roles, so you could share different perspectives on this point. Please answer the question in the chat. If you'd like to share any thoughts, we'll build on this, on your input for the panel discussion. We're going to give a couple of minutes for participants to share their thoughts, and then so I can see Laura mentioning identifying triggers, multi-risk triggers for anticipatory action. I don't know if anyone would like to share other thoughts, but it's definitely an issue we're also observing. Availability of data, absolutely. Granularity of data in some countries. It's very hard just to go back to the question raised by one of our participants. It's very hard to use standard indicators across all different countries because data is not always available for them all. Interconnected nature of risks, of risk factors, absolutely. cascading effect and white noise, reliability of data and political biases, absolutely. Okay. So as more colleagues, participants share their thoughts, I would like to ask the question to Tess, for her to start sharing her thoughts on what are the main challenges in anticipating multi-risks based on your experience at the Climate Center and your support of different country programs. Over to you, Tess.
Thank you so much. And yeah, so this is a really, really important question that we're working through a lot. So how can we better prepare for events or crises that are driven by multiple different hazards that are not very clear cut and that might be characterized by a high vulnerability, a lot of people exposed, etc. So what I see as part of the Climate Center of the Red Cross is that I work mostly in conflict affected settings. So that's already typically context affected by very high levels of vulnerability, limited governance, and typically also quite high exposure to different climate-related risks, but then also, of course, conflict and other socioeconomic risks as well. And I think we're starting to talk more and more about multi-hazard, multi-risk, which is quite technical in a way. Like it's a very technical way of describing the lived reality for many people, right? That someone is concerned about the price of food, but then at the same time might still be thinking about their house potentially being flooded, and maybe concerned about escalations of conflict, as we're seeing right now as well. So I think this is something that we're seeing as a lived reality for many, but often when we talk about this within the humanitarian sector, at least, it's very often quite siloed. So we have people that are experienced very much in flood preparedness, where we have people responding to food security, we have people responding to health crises. And one of the issues is that we don't often get everyone on the same table and have coherent responses that cover all of the different needs. So I think there's a bit of a mismatch there. And one of the things we've done in the last 2 years is we've set up a working group within the Anticipation Hub that looks at multi-risk anticipatory action. So how can we take action before crises hit or the impacts unfold in humanitarian organizations more effectively for these types of events? And we did a bit of a round to see, okay, what are some of the challenges? And I think, well, the main one that I just mentioned was that idea of silos. And this cartoon illustrates that quite well, that we do still see that it's quite difficult to coordinate across these different levels of expertise. That means, for example, in an area affected by high levels of displacement, where you're trying to respond to a flood, you might need to have different people around the table than in an area where you don't have very high levels of displacement. But at the same time, I think it's not only a coordination issue, it's very much a technical issue as well, in the sense that it requires more technical capacity to be able to analyze risks in an integrated way, that you are able to understand how much of the impact is driven by floods, impacts, a flood-related hazard, or drought, or maybe economic issues as well. And how do you untangle it to then come up with a logical intervention that addresses the root causes of the impacts that people are experiencing? So I think it's, on the one hand, a technical issue, on the other hand, a coordination issue. And the main challenge that we see, and I think one example was in Mozambique and Madagascar in February, we saw that there's an ongoing monkeypox outbreak. There were 2 consecutive tropical cyclones, and that just constrains people's operational capacity. That constrains the time that we have to do analyses. It constrains the ability to move goods and people around, and it also constrains our ability to act effectively. So I think it's also an operational challenge that we're seeing quite a lot in the sector. And I think I'll come back on in a second before I jump over to Michael's slide. I think it's now stuck. and it's now jumping over a lot. Sorry, I think we have a little glitch. Before I go into all the windows of opportunity, I think it would be really nice to also hear a little bit from the others what some of the challenges are also on the analysis side. This is a big part of the story, but I think I also really wanted to highlight some of the operational challenges that with all the analysis in the world, we can't always act still because it's often quite complex.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tess. I just have a follow-up question for you very, very quickly. You mentioned capacity. I mean, it's a technical issue. You mentioned capacity. I often observe that available tools tend to be quite technical, so not always accessible. So what is the Climate Center doing to address this issue?
Yeah,
Particularly when it comes to enabling local decision makers.
It's such a good question. So one of those entry points that we're working on a lot now is contingency planning. So there's quite a lot of investment within the sector in contingency planning. It's an important entry point, but very often it's separate plans. So you have a contingency plan for floods, you have a contingency plan for drought, you have a contingency plan for conflict, but they don't speak to each other. And then we have the other layer of anticipatory action, which means that you define forecast-based triggers for action and you connect funding to it as well. So that adds another level of complexity if you have those plans also in your operational environment. So we're trying to help develop more accessible methodologies to connect this so that you can build out scenarios or workshop formats to work through some of those connections. And that's something that ACAPS, of course, also does really well, is this whole thinking of what if A, B, and C happen? What has happened in the past? What do we maybe foresee in the future? So we're really trying to focus on training for this and to also consider better frameworks that we can also offer to different parts of the organization. And at the same time, it's a lot about experience sharing, because if you're working in Somalia, you're always responding to different types of crises at the same time. So realistically, there's already a lot of capacity and experience there, but we don't always translate it. So we typically separate it out at a higher level, and that's a shame. So I think it's also very much about being able to ground it very locally, and there's already a lot of experience there.
Thank you very much. So I'll move so I'll ask the same question to Michael now. Please, do you have any thoughts to share on the based on the challenges you faced with the MECAN project in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen?
I mean, broadly, I think I'm a bit guilty of the cartoon in Tess's, or in Tess's cartoon, is that I think broadly for us, we're on the early warning information side, it was really hard to parse out or to kind of create that interconnection, quantify the interconnection between like the hazards, the conflict. There's too many moving parts at once. So quantitatively, yeah, I feel very guilty on that cartoon. So thank you, Tess, for that. But that's a really, really good point. Kind of just going over some of the things that I learned from the MECAN project. I mean, just broadly, it's an early warning platform, predicts agriculture drought and floods, agriculture drought 4 months into the future, and flooding up to 3 days, 72 hours into the future. And it covers Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. So I think some other participants brought up the question of data, and there is really a lack of data. There seems to be quite a bit of kind of, let's say, observational tools, but when it comes to prediction, there really isn't so many. Like at the beginning of the project, the Google Flood Hub didn't cover, which is the main kind of flood prediction tool, I would say now, more central one than GLOFAST, just because it covers now flash flood and river flood. At the beginning of the project, it didn't cover the Middle East. Only recently, I think in the past 6 months, it covers Iraq with like their experimental flood prediction layer. GLOFAST, the other one, is, as I think everyone's familiar with, is just covered, it's limited to river flooding. So I think that, when it comes to the data availability side of things, I think, there's a lot of observational data about drought, about rainfall, but the prediction side is still like a little bit open, though it's closing, at least in the Middle East. I can't speak for other regions. I think the lesson learned is that, yeah, it's really, just focused on the hazard and the exposure to the hazard. So we predicted floods and droughts, and we estimated the agricultural hectares and the number of people and IDPs and IDP camps exposed to the flood and drought, for example. But we didn't make that connection. Goes back to Tessa's point, that connection between if they're purely exposed to the hazard, how many of those people would be displaced, and where would they go? That's like kind of a missing link that we didn't have enough time, I think, on the MIACAM project to really develop. I think that's kind of was something we wanted to do, and I think was in the original mandate of the project, but was just like another layer of complexity that we didn't fully meet. But we did just calculate just the pure exposure. Flood modeling, I think, is something like a lesson learned from the project, is that flood modeling using open source data. So this is all using open source satellite imagery streaming in from Google Earth Engine. So the idea is that flood modeling, flash flood modeling, is not really a set in stone, one methodology in academia even. So we were kind of up against many competing methodologies. So we chose our approach, which is using synthetic aperture radar. We went with it, and but it's the idea is that there's many ways to predict flooding, and we chose a way, but there is no kind of set methodology that I think that would be easily explainable, I think, to stakeholders as we socialized it around. Trying to explain radar imagery was a bit of a challenge. It might have been better to start simpler and then kind of evolve it over time. I think kind of again, this is just from early warning information side, we didn't action it over the course of the program, as it was just an information tool. But as we socialized it in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, we realize it takes a lot of time to adopt tools. I mean, just imagine at Mercy Corps, it took a lot of time for us to get used to the Microsoft Office versus the Google suite. So going to these ministries and going to 8 actors and showing a new tool, even though we got very positive response, it takes layers of kind of bureaucracy and approvals and socialization to really let the tool sink in to kind of action it. So that's something that we underestimated the time, but I think a really good lesson learned. Let's see. I have a kind of a list of hot takes here. Yeah, I think in the early warning information space, this is what I'm really interested about from the other panelists, is that it was relatively expensive to develop, relatively speaking, based on kind of humanitarian grants, not like a Google-sized budget. But I think that there's less of an appetite to develop these specific tools and more of an appetite for action. So I think this is a big challenge in the early warning information space, is that we really want to develop the tool. Like, we did as good as we could with the MIACAM, and I think the product is good. But to really kind of take it fully, it requires a bit more resourcing than what I think the appetite is from humanitarian donors for this kind of products. And yeah, again, I think there's more appetite for action. But the idea is that I'm not sure if it's a lack of, there is a lack of anticipatory action programs in the Middle East, but it's kind of to be seen that, with the MIACAM, and we've socialized it a bit with 8 actors and ministries, if we build it, the programs will come, or if there's just a lack of, it's just not a priority in the region just due to the funding constraints. This is kind of a big question going around in my head as I'm looking back on the program. But yeah, I'll stop there. Don't know if I went over.
Thank you, Michael. And that's perfect transition for Adrian to share his thoughts. Adrian has been working on linking research, findings, and action. So Adrian, I'd really like to share your thoughts on this point, challenges you observe, and also based on what Michael mentioned, the kind of lack of appetite for moving beyond the tool, which and so take actions or informed decision making based on tools, which can be very fancy but not always translating into action. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. And to Michael's point, that it's kind of difficult to find the follow-up funding or to really scale those initiatives. I think it's the hard thing is that you really have to demonstrate the value of what you're building, and often you kind of start from scratch or start anew. And for the specific area you're looking into, you might work with certain data sources that are available, but others are not, and it changes from context to context. So it's kind of hard really in a short time period that those projects are usually set up to really build something that like would be robust on for an operational deployment, right? You sort of try out different things, you learn, and then you know how to make it better next time. But it's kind of hard within the time frame of those budgets then to really prove and show the value of the product and to get some sort of the follow-up funding. And yeah, also very thankful for Michael to having given this insight, these very practical challenges in terms of data availability and all of that. I think from a practical perspective, those are quite obvious. Once you work in a project like this, they immediately jump in your face, so to say. But I also want to come back maybe at a more basic level, some challenges that I noticed time and again and that are not necessarily as obvious. And it's what kind of zooming out a little bit from this very practical things we have discussed so far. I think those compounding risks or multi-risks, they really require experts from different fields to come together. And when and if they come up with a solution, also need to find the right language and the right, to communicate it to practitioners and decision makers. So that's yet another bridge that needs to be crossed. And I think when we think about climate change and conflict, so this is the area I've been mostly involved in, it has kind of a fuzziness around the concepts that we use because, popular understanding, climate change, okay, yeah, that's just global warming, the world is getting warmer. But in the context of conflict and climate, we think about much more localized phenomena, right? About a specific drought or flood, and its very localized impacts on displacement, on conflict risk, on food insecurity, etc. And then also every conflict situation is different, right? We might have some riparian states in a river basin and they fight over water, and there we might be interested more in rainfall over longer time periods and how it accumulates, or we might look into something very local, farmer herder conflicts, and then we're interested in and maybe shifts in the cycle of wet and dry season and how that affects like the mobility and cropping and grazing patterns. So in those different situations, we have really different things in mind when we think about climate change. I mean, we're not even thinking about climate change. We think about possible manifestations of climate change, possible knock-on effects. And so you have the situation when two people meet and they want to talk about climate and conflict. Quite often they think about very different things, have very different associations and images in their minds. And this only becomes really evident once they start working together and get confused. And it's like, oh yeah, why did you build this model and give me predictions for the next 30 years? I'm interested in knowing if there's going to be a drought next month. So those mismatches then happen. And so maybe as a learning from that, I think it's really worth investing time ahead to first manage the expectations of your client in terms of what you can achieve with a model like this, and then also really try to spend some time in developing a common understanding about around these very basic concepts. And I think and that's a little bit hard to sell at first because, yeah, I mean, do you want to really go back at defining these concepts like climate and so on? It doesn't really sound as urgent, but I'd say this sort of pays off long term or over the course of the project if you really invest a little bit at the start to build this common language and understanding.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Is there any question from the audience on the points raised by our panelists so far? I've seen a question has been addressed. Perhaps a follow-up question for Michael is about how the MECAM tools early warning, so specific risks for drought and floods, the tool identified triggered action, considering from Mercy Corps teams. Was there a system, or is there a system to link the findings of the tool with the action, operational action from your colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, we came from the in the MIACAM platform, we have thresholds for what we call drought watch and drought warning. So one is like, it's kind of based on probability. We should have just done directly probability, but essentially we have drought watch and drought warning for agricultural drought. I can't remember how we outline it off the top of my head, to be honest, to go through how, but we have outlined that in a paper I'll put in the chat about connecting MIACAM to action. So we have outlined this. So we kind of came up with our own agriculture drought threshold based on kind of testing with past droughts. And this is what we've connected it to with flooding. We let that be user input, to be honest. We had the user input the rainfall thresholds, which they consider heavy. And then we do kind of then on the smaller map, I mean, it's hard to explain without the demo. Look at it identifies areas where that rainfall, if that threshold exceeds like the 90th, 95th percentile. So we did put that into the paper also, but long story short, it's in there, but we did not specify it to a certain like country specification, or it was more from our head, and then we applied it to hypothetical kind of actions, let's say.
Thank you very much. There is a question in the chat on whether you're planning to expand the tool, adding new countries, additional countries in the region, Michael.
Yeah, I'll be brief. Not at the moment. We don't have funding for it, but we'd love to do it. Yes, it's needed in other countries in the region.
Thank you very much. Tess, please, over to you.
Yeah, I've been told that I can just jump in with random
Yes,
questions.
you
I'll
can.
just do that now. But maybe for Adrian, I think you touched on a couple of challenges that I think we also really see on the sort of operational side, and of course also on the analytical side. And you were talking about this idea of what the risk connections could be. There's a lot of assumptions that we typically work with, right? So we might have an idea about how risks are connected, and that's what we might also be looking for in the analysis. So is that something that you guys have been looking into? And have there been examples where you might have come up with an analysis that really challenged people's perception of the connections between climate and conflict risks, for example? And how did you then deal with that? Because I think it can also be quite controversial sometimes if you share some of these analyses. I'm just curious if you've had this experience in the past.
I don't think we really ran into very controversial terrain. Absolutely right that in terms of the assumptions, you really need to be extremely explicit and precise about them if you want to build something like a very granular or predictive model. And then, yeah, it's really hard to really know for sure. And there's a really just a big gap in terms of knowledge when we think about very precisely how these things interact, not just, what type of climatic shock or pressure might interact with what type of conflict dynamic, but also how do they interact in over time and in space? Is there going to be something right after the flood or the drought? Is conflict going to increase, or is it going to be a week later or months later? We don't know in most cases, and also the issue of the assumptions about the spatial connections are not evident. You might have something happening in some area, and it has an effect on something completely elsewhere, maybe even in a different country, if we factor in like things like supply chains or migration or whatnot, all the interconnections that exist. And those things are very, very hard to operationalize and measure because we don't have the data, and also we don't even know for sure. We don't even have the very precise assumptions. So we sort of revert back to the, I would say, safer assumptions, the things that have been more established in the literature and also by experience, and relying also on the expertise of partners. In a very specific context, they might have an idea about how those things play out over time and in space. But then it's kind of hard to go beyond that and to translate this to a different context. So yeah, I think those assumptions are very something that's very hard, and where we're not even fighting against a scarcity of data, but also, let's say, a scarcity of knowledge really about how these things really connect and how to connect in different places.
Thank you very much, Adriana. We have a question from Margot at International Crisis Group. $1 million question. The trade-off between granularity and scalability. when it comes to multi-hazard risk monitoring. That's for all of you. I don't know if anyone would like to start first.
I could actually jump in
Please.
because, yeah, Margot, I think you're putting a really interesting topic on the table. We've been working with, I think, also a craft-funded project similar to what you're doing, where we also had this challenge of do we bring together data in that we can scale very easily across contexts, or do we bring in that local nuance? And I think Adrian, you touched on this as well. And I think there's a very there's this delicate balance between offering ease and scale quite quickly with global data sources, recognizing uncertainties in them, and also doing some checking of skill and validating it, and then bringing in local perspectives. So I think something like the risk radar does that really nicely, that you're able to combine global data with country-specific contextual knowledge. And I think that's kind of the level that we need to get to. But then do we need that in all the different organizations, or can there be some kind of connection between them? Because I think, Michael, you put this on the table as well, the costs of developing and how you can then build off each other or learn from each other more effectively there. So I think this is a really big trade-off, and it depends very much, and I think we'll talk about this, is what you're trying to inform. So this project that I was talking about here before that's something that's trying to inform sort of geospatial prioritization. Should we go to the north or to the south? Do we need to shift our offices across the country because we see changes? Like this was a case in Nigeria a couple of years ago where the conflict had really shifted and therefore structures had to shift with it. But that's a very different types of skill than when you're talking about what is the specific need in this specific community and what does that look like in the next 2 months and the next year, right? So I think it's also very much about what you're trying to inform there. But I guess the others might have thoughts on this as well.
Thank you, Tess. Yes, please, Adrian or Michael. Anything to add?
I would just say, yeah, I mean, looking forward, I mean, I might be jumping the gun on my question is I think when it comes to actioning these kind of, like, at least again, from information side, actioning the system, I think it'd be very wise to focus it onto like a area of interest, that's something I'll talk about later. But yeah, I think scaling it to the budget that we realistically will have is extremely important.
Yes, so I would say, of course, it is a trade-off in practical terms, but I think it can be solved if in the project you just are very explicit about your scope and your what you actually want to use the system for, what your use case is, because then it's quite clear, how you calibrate different things. And again, it's, I guess, some work to be done between the client and the implementing organization to really agree on something and be very specific about the requirements really at the start of the project, so that you don't end up doing like different things, but not really doing them well. So yeah, in my mind, it's more about an agreement and on the scope of the project, and then everything sort of follows from that.
Thank you very much. There is one question for Tess. It's a broad question on challenges you observe in translating analysis to action, particularly when it comes to managing technical and coordination around multi-hazard forecasting. Do you have any insights, any thoughts to share on this, Tess?
Yeah, I think, Alex, you're hitting the nail on the head, as I say, because when we were working through this initial paper that I mentioned on my slide for this multi-risk working group, some of these questions came up. So I would unpack it in 2 parts. So on the one hand, we do see a lot of evidence within the sector that if you don't consider multi-risk interactions, then there's a very big risk of not being able to implement effectively when a crisis does occur. So there's been quite a lot of examples like this where anticipatory action wasn't reaching the potential that it could have because there was no prior planning or preparedness, or analysis of the interactions with other risks. So that means, for example, maybe there was a cyclone anticipatory action alert, but there were no provisions for recent escalations in conflict. So that meant that all of a sudden there were much more people exposed to floods in the floodplain because that was where an IDP camp was located, but it wasn't part of the original design of the anticipatory action framework, and therefore wasn't really considered. So that was a missed opportunity there. So there's quite some anecdotal evidence of this being a major operational challenge if we translate warnings into action. On the other hand, and this is really in some very protracted crises, we do see that there's sometimes only short-term gains. And that's, I think, a general conversation around anticipatory action. It's part of a bigger cycle, right? It's part of a cycle of preparedness, prevention, response, recovery, and then anticipatory action fits into that. And I think this came up in an evaluation in Ethiopia a couple of years ago as well, where while there were benefits for food security, they were only short-term because of all the complicated connections in the context as well. So there's a question there of how much more advanced do you need to make your analysis? How much more time do you need to spend on making your plans as robust as possible if the context is so complicated? And I think we don't really have the answer to this, but these are some of the questions that we're kind of working through. And there's no one size fits all. Like if in a context like in the evaluation from Ethiopia, and I think also from South Sudan at the time, that really hinted at very big structural issues. I don't think an anticipatory action framework is placed to solve those necessarily. But you can do quite a lot with a bit more preparedness, prevention, and a little bit more sort of a bigger scope of your analysis to at least preempt some of the potential issues. And I think that's kind of more solving the operational side of things. I hope that's an answer to your question. I think it's kind of really the issue that we're working through right now, and I think something we're exploring more.
Thank you very much, Tess. Adrian or Michael, is there anything you'd like to add on this point before we move to the second part of the discussion? Thank you very much. Over to you, Abbas. I'll start by placing a question for our participants into the chat.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And this has been a very interesting discussion that really set the scene in terms of the challenges we experience in addressing multi-risk hazards or multi-risk related issues. So I want us to look at what can be done, or what are the opportunities or the lessons learned from your experience, on which we can draw to help improve the way we capture these complex issues. I'm looking at the chat to see if there are any questions on that specific element. Feel free to add any questions to the chat, and then our panelists are going to reflect on this question as well. I'll give 2-3 minutes for the participants to put their questions.
It's easier to write on challenges than solutions. It can be small lessons learned from based on your experience, or some leads for a solution.
If none, I think we can start with our panelists, and then we'll take questions as we go. Maybe I'll start with Tess about this question. What can be done to strengthen multi-risk analysis and decision making from your experience?
Yeah, and maybe Evans, if you would be so kind to move to the slide with the circle thing on it, that would be super nice. Thank you. Yeah, this is a figure from UNDR from a report from a while ago, but it's one of those that shows kind of what I was talking about before. That and we've talked about anticipatory action a little bit now in this conversation. I think when we're talking about how you can apply multi-risk analysis and what the windows of opportunity are, I think it's really important to think about timelines. So I think the work that Michael was showing is a really good tool to get more information around imminent risks that are emerging in the context, and that allows you to take some action in the time before the crisis would hit. And that's what we typically try to push for within the anticipatory action community, that we make use of early warning information to then generate some action before people get affected. But that's only part of the puzzle, right? So there's, on the one hand, we can use improved multi-risk analysis and maybe more sensitive triggers. I can talk a lot about the technical innovations on this and super cool ideas and all of that, but I think that's only part of the story, and I think that also came out in the chat. So you can use some of this to then enable action before crisis hits. But then there's also a lot of other work that happens within the humanitarian sector, and more broadly, I think also, where this really, really helps, and where we can see some good innovation. So I mentioned contingency planning already. I think that's really helpful. It's also really useful to think about sort of this multi-risk lens when we think about recovery and reconstruction. Not often talked about as much yet. I think anticipatory action is very sexy at the moment. There's a lot of attention for forecasting, but there is also a huge need for more sort of climate smart, multi-risk informed recovery down the line as well, whenever a crisis has hit. Because we do see that these cycles of vulnerability are becoming stronger, especially with more intense extreme events as well. And then there's a lot of work that we can draw on and that we can inform around preparedness and around sort of risk-informed strategic decision-making, not just on specific imminent or specific crisis events, but also, as I was speaking about before, we're really looking at how we can inform decisions on where to focus on within a country more effectively right now. And that's just in the annual planning. We can think about better information that can help with multidisciplinary programming. So making sure that whenever there's a program set up, that it also considers, for example, the links between health risks and food insecurity and maybe water extremes. That's one of those examples. And it seems really simple. I think it's often done already. So there's already a lot of entry points, but can definitely be strengthened a lot more. I think I'll keep it to that. I think there's a lot of very specific examples. Happy to talk about them, but also really curious to hear what Adrian and Michael think about this and what your experience is showing as good entry points or opportunities as well.
Would you like to go first, Adrian?
Sure. I got stuck a little bit on the chat because I saw this comment by Dennis on establishing trust. And I really like that because, yeah, I think we tend to maybe underestimate in projects that seem to be primarily technical projects, that they're also, in a way, social projects, right? You have to sort of establish a relationship with your user and gain their trust and sort of advocate for the use of certain data and explain things. And it's this whole process is also part, I would say, of the system that you build. And maybe, yeah, we also don't spend enough time in projects building early warning systems on really ensuring that this relationship is sustainable. You know, you might be working with a person, and then a year later they work in a different position, and it's someone else, and you don't really have that relationship anymore. And so, yeah, absolutely, I would absolutely second that comment and say that we need to invest more in these relationships. But maybe coming back to a more technical point, I think. Something I would like to advocate for is in early warning system and analysis to be more mindful of possible like connections cross-border about that, you know, something might happen in one country and it might have very dramatic effects in another country. I feel like a lot of projects tend to really focus on the country context or, you know, maybe even subnational context and it's kind of hard to bring in information that might be relevant. You know, if there's like a major grain exporting country like or fertilizers like Ukraine, and that's being attacked. Obviously, this has an impact also on how you can address food security risks and how you can address impacts of climate change in many countries far away. And so, yeah, I would advocate to be more sensitive to this sort of cross-border global perspective, and maybe also bring in information on supply chains, information on migration. And I guess there are opportunities to connect different projects. So, for instance, there are projects that monitor disruptions in maritime trade, and that they kind of see how trade or how port infrastructure is impacted by climate, and then they sort of estimate how this might affect maritime trade, and use all this fancy GPS data from ships. And but it would be interesting to sort of connect a project like this, I think, to a project with the more studying more localized impacts in a specific context. So I guess there are many more points and entry points for improving things on a technical level, but that's the one I'd like to highlight here for the moment.
Thanks, Adrian, for highlighting the need for emphasizing the need for trust, but also collaboration across areas of competencies. Michael, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a good point by Adrian. When you talk about the supply chains and localization of, kind of looking for more localized knowledge, I think this requires at this point, at least in the Middle East, I don't know the rest of the regions, but a qualitative analysis, like a more kind of sophisticated, complex qualitative analysis of, because there's no way because supply chains is something that we've looked into on a different team for a different project, but it's really, really hard to understand what's going where without some high resolution satellite truck monitoring, all this kind of spy thing, that feels a bit weird. But to get it more connected to the topic at hand, food security, I think kind of a more in-depth qualitative look at this would be maybe in hand with whatever local authority would make sense, more sense than trying to quantify it, because it's a hard road. I'll pause. Sorry, I'll finish my thought, Adrian. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. But yeah, just kind of opportunities, how to kind of maybe socialize this better. I think I agree with Dennis 100%. Need to socialize disinformation platforms like the machine learning platform from the MIACAM, like the machine learning models. It needs kind of full support, hand in hand with the ministries that we've met with, more than just a few meetings and some WhatsApp chats. Really need like dedicated support to action it. That's kind of my main point. I think the other one would be that making this extremely user-friendly. The MIACAM for our experience could have been easier to use. So I guess it's simplifying it down to like a graduated risk alerts, like kind of make it look like more standard tools. That's a big one. And I think scaling down, going back to the previous comment, I think a future move for the MIACAM that we're pitching is that scaling it down in Yemen, for example, this is a specific product kind of proposal, into a specific wadi that always floods pretty much every year in Yemen. And then basically calibrating the MIACAM a bit tighter for the specific area, and then working with the Mercy Corps team to hopefully, because it's an eco-funded cash programs that we have there, to use it to inform, at least pilot the feasibility of an anticipatory crisis modifier. I think then we kind of step by step proving that this tool can be useful is something that we want to do, is I think a logical next step. But yeah.
Thanks, Michael. Anything the other panelists want to add to it?
There is a point I'd like to add on what Michael just mentioned on qualitative analysis. I find this point extremely relevant. What we observed at ACAPS when we work on climate shocks is that there is a relatively good amount of information on the shocks, but not always information understanding how different population groups experience the shocks. And this is what we are trying to do, complementing quantitative data with qualitative data to understand localized vulnerabilities shocks based on different gender, age, disability, other intersecting identity factors, for example. And this is something that you can achieve with qualitative analysis. And this is not just because historically that's something that we look into to inform targeting and humanitarian action. But this is also key to inform and to design a resilience, long-term coping efforts and resilience building efforts. And that's a point that I think resonate with what Michael shared.
Thanks,
Maybe
Vanessa.
Abbas, if I can add two things, maybe. I think what comes up from across is there's definitely, if you want to make analyses actionable, there needs to be a framework, a way to channel funding into action in the end. And I think, Michael, what you're mentioning around crisis modifiers is an excellent opportunity. I think we've seen good results with that across different countries where we at least have some ability to change the course, and we're not locked into standard plans or pre-agreed annual plans in advance, and we can adapt based on a more acute analysis or maybe an evolving understanding of how crises might be compounding, how different things might be influencing each other. And that also gives us space to, for example, think about skills, as what Adrian was saying, I think is really relevant. That on the one hand, what we do within the Red Cross, we do a lot of community-based assessments and conversations to understand local perceptions of risks, capacities to deal with risks. And I mean, I've been part of this as well. And if you speak to a community, for example, we did this in Mindanao in the Philippines, they won't just talk about the cyclone risk that they're maybe concerned about. They will talk about all the different risks that they're at the moment facing. And that might be unsafe roads, that might be the risk of violence and robbery, that might be a risk of food security challenges. And those are connected. So I think that's a really, really relevant base for conversations. But then at the same time, our job is also to connect it to risks that are maybe outside of that view of people. So to be able to connect it with global risks at the same time. So I think that's a really important point that I also just wanted to emphasize, that ability to work across skills. And what we found really useful is, in the end, these analyses are typically just what I think someone put in the chat. It's a point where people can come together and have a good conversation. And if that's what it facilitates, and then it leads to decisions that are slightly more agile, more adapted, I think that's what the end goal should be. So it's not really about creating the best map or creating the most beautiful visual. It's about having people have a good conversation about it, owning information, questioning it, because there's loads of uncertainty, and then making informed decisions based on that. So I think that's also something we're really trying to push for more. And that needs time, resources, and buy-in the end to be able to achieve that. So I think Adrian and Michael really highlighted a couple of really good practices to bring people along in that analysis, because otherwise, the trust is not going to be there either. So I just wanted to emphasize a couple of those points, because they're really kind of make or break for translating risk analysis into action down the line.
Thanks a lot, Tessa, for emphasizing the importance of local voices. It is something that we often lack in the secondary data information that we have access to. So I agree that it's something interesting. Analysis should also build on to develop something closer to the reality and something more relevant than just what makes sense from what we see on the media. Definitely. Any final reflections on any of the points mentioned? Any questions from the audience? If not, I'll hand it over to you, Vanessa.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Abbas. Thank you, colleagues, for joining today. Thanks to the panelists for this very insightful conversation on challenges and entry points, opportunities to improve multi-risk analysis. The session will end unless there are additional comments or questions? I don't see any. So thank you very much, everyone. And we hope we'll see you at the next HNPW ACAPS events. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.